About quickly is identifying clipping in our photos. And clipping refers to areas that are either so bright or so dark that there's really no information in that part of the photo. This is typically more problematic when we have areas that are overexposed or too bright, because when we print them or even when we put them on the computer, there's really no information there, and it almost feels as though there's a hole in the photograph. And this becomes even more notable when we print them because there won't be any ink on that part of the paper. So to avoid that, what we're going to do is look and we're going to use our histogram to help us identify areas that are blown out. So I'm going to go through some of these photos and I'm going to find one that I know is a little bit overexposed in areas. Might not be a great photo, but a good example of where we would see clipping. All right. So when I look at this photo, uh, I want to know where it's too bright. And for me, I get the sense right here, it's probably going to be a little bit lighter than I would like for it to be. And if I go over to my histogram, if you look, I can see generally what my range of light and dark is. And so if I look down here, I don't have a whole lot in the way of deep blacks, right? It kind of tapers down at the bottom, but I do have a lot of kind of mid-tone dark values in here. And you can see that in here and in the spots in between the rocks. But over here, where I get my exposure kind of at its lightest end, I've got this little bar that's touching the edge of my histogram. And what that's telling me is there's probably something that is brighter than I would like for it to be. Now, best practice is to look at this while you're taking photos, especially if it's a really bright day. Your light meter in your camera is going to try and find balance between light and dark and hit that center line. But if you have a really bright sky and a really dark foreground, it can have a hard time figuring out what the right light balance is. So once you take your photo, go and check your histogram. But as you open things in Lightroom, you might notice that some of your photos are a little over or underexposed. One quick way to tell what is over or underexposed is if you hit the letter J on your keyboard, you'll see this little patch of red pop up. And when you see that, it's telling me these are the areas that are a little bit too bright and there's no information there. Now, sometimes we can fix that really easily. You know, it could just be a matter of making like a little spot adjustment and dropping the exposure if it's a minor one. But sometimes if it's covering a larger area, it's going to be really hard to adjust because there's just no information to pull from. Conversely, you can also click on this and it'll bring up your over and underexposed areas, or essentially the areas with clipping. And if I click this side, it'll tell me which is underexposed. And you can see right now, I have nothing that's pure black and lacking information. Now, the other thing to note, in some images, you might have more of this dark value. If you do see these underexposed areas, and I'm going to see if I can kind of create one for you. So do this. Obviously, I would never want an image to look like this, but for the sake of example, now that I've dropped this down and I've pulled down my blacks, you'll see I'm starting to get these blue areas. And so whenever it shows up as blue, that's telling me it's really dark. And so I won't see any visual detail. This isn't always as problematic. Sometimes it can be, but photos, you have more leeway with those dark areas because they can create a really elegant and sort of atmospheric quality to what it is you're doing and really impact the mood. So those you have a little bit more wiggle room with, but the one to be careful of is that overexposed option. And again, if I hit the letter J on my keyboard, it'll turn that off so I can see what's going on. And that, in a nutshell, is identifying areas with clipping.